Welcome to Resilient Inspirations. Around here, we believe every story carries a lesson and every question opens a new door. Think of this as friends talking over coffee, exploring ideas together. So let's get started, and I'll pass the mic to the conversation.
Welcome to The Debate. What if the absolute best thing you could do for your career and, well, for your own psychological development today is to broadcast your biggest mistake to everyone you know?
Wow. I mean, that is a terrifying thought for most people.
Right? Because for decades, corporate culture and societal norms have essentially taught us to hide our flaws. We're supposed to project invulnerability and, bury our errors. But today we're asking a really fundamental question about the ethics of human connection.
And it's a complicated one.
It really is. The core question is public vulnerability and the active admission of mistakes a necessary mechanism for human progress? Or is it a hazardous, maybe even reckless strategy that ignores the psychological realities of fragile self-esteem and, well, the intensely punitive nature of our modern digital age?
Yeah, it is one of the most critical tensions we face right now, especially as the line between our public and private lives just completely dissolves. To navigate this, we're drawing on a pretty broad synthesis of sociological and clinical source material today.
Exactly. We have a lot of ground to cover.
We do. We'll be looking at Adam Grant's work on the science of rethinking and Brené Brown's extensive research on shame and vulnerability. We're pairing that with clinical frameworks of ego defenses. And critically, we have to weigh all of that against contemporary sociological analyses of things like the pratfall effect and online cancel culture.
So to set the stage, I will be arguing that embracing intellectual humility, acting with what psychologists call confident vulnerability, and actively detaching your identity from your opinions are profound ethical imperatives. They aren't just, nice ideas. They are absolutely essential for genuine human connection and broad societal progress.
And I come at it from a very different angle. I will argue that unconditionally promoting public vulnerability, like treating it as a universal mandate, is actually psychologically naive. It completely ignores the protective necessity of ego defenses for the vast majority of people who, quite frankly, operate with highly fragile self-esteem.
Which is a lot of people.
Most people. Furthermore, demanding this kind of exposure really dismisses the severe social ostracism that is just baked into our modern digital arenas.
Okay, let's lay out the core of these positions, starting with what the data actually tells us about high performers. When you look at the research, the smartest and most successful people actively change their minds. I mean, they operate like scientists.
Right, rather than politicians or preachers.
Exactly. Instead of acting like a preacher defending a sacred sermon or a prosecutor attacking an ideological opponent, they actively search for reasons why they themselves might be wrong. Genuine confidence, which I define as stable, non-contingent self-worth, actually requires the courage to risk being wrong publicly.
But that's a massive risk for most.
It is, but Brené Brown's research on wholeheartedness beautifully illustrates why it's necessary. She defines vulnerability not as a weakness, but as the literal birthplace of courage, joy, and moral leadership. Overcoming our societal allergy to vulnerability is the only way we build systemic trust and combat cognitive blind spots.
Like the Dunning-Kruger effect?
Yes, exactly, where people literally lack the competence to recognize their own incompetence. You can't fix that without vulnerability.
Okay, that is a compelling argument. And, wholeheartedness is a beautiful ideal. But have you considered the clinical reality of how the human mind actually functions under stress?
How do you mean?
While demanding public vulnerability ignores the fundamental architecture of the human ego, most people do not walk around with stable, non-contingent self-worth. They operate with fragile, contingent self-esteem. Their value is highly dependent on their performance, their appearance, and external validation.
So they need those defenses.
Absolutely. Humans utilize necessary ego defenses mechanisms like denial, rationalization, and compartmentalization to protect themselves from the crushing anxiety of failure. In an era defined by digital permanence, where an error is archived forever, asking people to publicly discard these psychological shields is effectively demanding psychological self-harm.
Wait, pause for a second. You just said that for most people, an error triggers a need to protect themselves from crushing anxiety? You're saying that if my self-worth is fragile, my brain actually interprets a mistake at work as a physical threat to my survival?
It does.
Walk me through that. How does a simple typo or like a miscalculation trigger a primitive survival defense?
It absolutely does. And we really have to understand this mechanism if we're going to talk about the ethics of vulnerability. Let's look at the 2x2 framework of self-esteem used by clinical psychologists.
Okay.
You have the level of self-esteem, so high or low, and you have the stability of it, stable or fragile. What we see everywhere, especially in high-achieving environments, are people with seemingly high self-esteem that is incredibly fragile because it is highly contingent.
Ah, so it's conditional.
Exactly. Their internal monologue is conditional. I am only valuable if I succeed, or I am only worthy if I am praised. So when they make that typo on a major presentation, it isn't just a localized learning opportunity. It is an existential threat to their curated self-image.
So the brain reacts as if it's under literal attack?
To their psychological equilibrium, yes. When that contingent self-worth is threatened, it triggers what clinicians call image-distorting defenses. A classic example is splitting.
Splitting? Like black and white thinking?
Right. The ego cannot handle the nuance of, I am a good person who made a bad mistake. So it divides the world into all good or all bad. The individual might suddenly see themselves as utterly worthless over one single error, which is paralyzing.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. Or more commonly, they utilize projection, casting their unacceptable ignorance onto a colleague. Like, I didn't make a mistake, the data team gave me bad numbers. These aren't intentional character flaws. They are unconscious, real-time processes designed to protect the mind from intolerable anxiety and shame.
Okay, I hear the clinical reality in that, but look at the long-term consequence of what you're describing. Let's use an analogy here. Having contingent self-esteem is like building a beautiful house on a fault line.
Okay, I'm following.
You can decorate the house perfectly with external praise, fancy job titles, and flawless presentations. But the moment the ground shakes, the moment you make a public error, the entire structure threatens to collapse. Ego defenses, like projecting blame onto the data team, are just psychological duct tape trying to hold the walls together.
That's one way to look at it.
But my pushback is this. Doesn't shielding contingent self-esteem merely guarantee that the house remains structurally unsound forever?
Well, duct tape might not be an architectural marvel, but it keeps the wind out when a literal storm is hitting. It provides survival in hostile environments. I mean, you don't tear your house down to the studs while a hurricane is raging outside.
But if you never rebuild the foundation, you never develop internal resilience. The psychological research shows that transitioning from those primitive image-distorting defenses to mature defense mechanisms actually requires facing that discomfort.
Mature defenses like what?
Like humor, altruism, or sublimation, where you channel that difficult feeling of failure into productive action. Getting there requires the temporary discomfort of facing our shame triggers. You have to expose the wound to the air for it to heal.
But exposing the wound publicly?
Brené Brown's research makes it clear that we numb vulnerability to avoid pain, but we cannot selectively numb emotion. When we numb fear and shame with these primitive defenses, we also numb joy, creativity, and belonging. You cannot live a fulfilled life if you are constantly terrified of being found out.
I don't disagree that the transition to mature defenses is the ultimate goal of psychological development. But we cannot mandate it as a public performance.
Why not?
Because even Brown acknowledges that vulnerability is not a victory march. She explicitly calls it a cold and broken hallelujah. It is an excruciating, messy process.
It is messy, yes.
When a clinician helps someone transition from splitting and denial to self-observation, they do it in a highly controlled, safe, therapeutic environment, not on a public stage. And certainly not in a corporate boardroom where the consequences of that cold and broken hallelujah can literally cost you your livelihood.
But all of these internal psychological defenses don't happen in a vacuum. The public stage, the boardroom, the team meeting, that is exactly where we test and forge genuine confidence. But let's follow your thread into the workplace. If an employee actually takes my advice and admits a massive failure today, you're arguing they face tangible professional destruction.
I am. Let's look at that. Because the hard-to-convince audience for your argument isn't the philosopher, It's the average professional who fears that admitting a mistake is career suicide. And frankly, the sociological data largely supports their fear.
The data supports hiding mistakes?
Let me introduce the pratfall effect. It was originally described in a 1966 experiment by Elliot Aronson.
Oh, right. This is the famous coffee spilling study, right?
Exactly. And it perfectly illustrates the double standard of vulnerability. So Aronson had participants listen to recordings of two actors pretending to be trivia contestants. One actor was presented as highly competent, answering like 92% of questions correctly.
Okay.
The other was an average person, answering only 30% correctly. At the end of the recording, both actors make a clumsy mistake. They spill a cup of coffee and apologize. The results completely undercut the universal mandate for vulnerability.
How so?
When the highly competent individual made the mistake, their likability actually increased. It humanized them. But when the average person made the exact same mistake, their likability plummeted.
I see. Because the mistake confirmed the audience's pre-existing bias about their mediocrity.
Precisely. Let's ground this in reality. Think about the smartest, most intimidating executive at your company. If they spill coffee on themselves during a pitch or admit they don't know the answer to a minor question, you actually like them more. They seem human.
Right, it's endearing.
Vulnerability, for them, is a status symbol. But if the junior employee who has been struggling all week spills the coffee or admits a gap in their knowledge, you don't think they're wonderfully wholehearted. You think they're a mess.
Oof.
For the average worker, showing weakness incurs a massive competence penalty. They are perceived as less effective and less capable. For them, hiding their mistakes isn't just an unconscious psychological reflex. It is a highly rational, self-protective career strategy.
I really have to push back on that interpretation, because it treats competence as a static trait, mostly tied to technical perfection or like a trivia score equivalent of IQ. It assumes that if you aren't the genius CEO, you can't afford to be honest.
Well, the perception of competence is what matters in a corporate hierarchy.
But let's look at more contemporary data. A recent study from UC Berkeley determined that emotional intelligence, EQ, was 4 times better at predicting a person's success than measuring their IQ. And on average, people with high EQ earn $29,000 more annually than people with low EQ.
Okay, but walk me through that. How does possessing emotional intelligence negate the competence penalty of making a public mistake?
Because a foundational component of high EQ is what Adam Grant calls confident humility. It is the security to say, I don't know, but I can find out. Why do they earn $29,000 more? Because they don't waste time and resources hiding their errors.
That assumes a healthy workplace, though.
They create the healthy workplace. They build better teams, they navigate office politics without triggering other people's ego defenses, and they learn faster. Furthermore, look at Google's Project Aristotle. It was a massive 5-year study into what makes teams effective. It wasn't the collective IQ of the members. It wasn't the seniority. The number one factor was psychological safety.
But hold on, psychological safety is created by leaders. It's a structural condition. It isn't created by vulnerable subordinates tossing themselves onto the sword.
It is a reciprocal ecosystem, though. Admitting a mistake doesn't signal incompetence. It signals a commitment to truth over ego. It shows that you prioritize the integrity of the project over your own momentary embarrassment.
In theory, yes.
When an average worker says, hey, I messed up this calculation on the supply chain report, let's fix it before it goes to the client, they aren't confirming mediocrity. They are demonstrating high-level self-observation and systemic integrity. That builds deep structural trust with colleagues, and trust is a much stronger career currency than the fragile illusion of perfection.
I hear the idealism in that, and I respect it. But look at the reality of the environments we're actually operating in. Your argument rests on the assumption of a benevolent, rational audience that carefully weighs emotional intelligence and prioritizes systemic integrity over short-term blame.
You don't think we have that?
We do not live in that world. We don't just work in nice, progressive corporate offices. We live in the digital arena. We live in the age of cyber ostracism, permanent public records, and cancel culture.
Well, the digital landscape certainly amplifies the stakes. I'll give you that. If you make a mistake online, you aren't just apologizing to a conference room of 12 people.
It doesn't just amplify the stakes, it mutates the very nature of human interaction. If you're listening to this and you've ever deleted a tweet because it didn't get enough likes or because someone took it out of context and you felt the panic of a pylon, you are engaging in these exact ego defenses.
Right, the rationalization.
And you are right to do so. We have an attention economy that algorithmically rewards outrage, binary views, and public shaming. When someone admits a mistake online or even tries to express a nuanced, evolving thought, the digital mob doesn't reward them with psychological safety. They weaponize the vulnerability.
It's the permanence of the digital record that scares people. The idea that a mistake at age 22 is searchable at age 40.
The permanence, yes, but also the sheer speed and volume of the retribution. Research indicates that 73% of social media users self-censor to avoid public shaming. And this isn't just about hurt feelings or losing followers.
It goes deeper than that.
Much deeper. The neurobiology of cyber-ostracism is profound. Being excluded or piled on digitally threatens fundamental human needs, our need for belonging, self-esteem, and control. Brain imaging actually shows that social rejection triggers the exact same neural pain centers, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, as physical injury.
Wow. So it literally physically hurts.
Yes. Your brain processes a Twitter mob the same way it processes a broken arm. When you demand that people publicly dismantle their ego defenses and admit their flaws in this environment, you are tossing them to the wolves. It is socially and psychologically irresponsible to tell vulnerable people to just, be brave.
I see the danger you're pointing out, and the neurobiological pain is undeniably real. I'm not dismissing that. But that digital hostility, that exact toxic ecosystem you just described, is precisely why we must champion intellectual humility.
Wait, how does feeding people to the outrage machine fix the machine?
By fundamentally changing the cultural metric of what it means to be a valuable participant in society. Let's lean into the philosophy of fallibility. Thinkers like John Stuart Mill and Karl Popper championed this. Fallibility is the recognition that our beliefs are always subject to revision, that we are, by definition, always capable of being wrong.
Okay, but how does that apply online?
If we surrender to self-censorship out of fear of cyber ostracism, what actually happens? We retreat into echo chambers. We create the exact polarization and identity bubbles that make the digital world so toxic in the first place.
People retreat to those bubbles because they are safe. The pain centers in their brain stop firing.
But they are epistemically dead, meaning their ability to seek truth and understand reality basically dies. Mill argued that we must have a collision with error. In plain English, we need to publicly crash our bad ideas into other people's good ideas.
A collision with error.
Exactly. If we don't, our ideas never get better. Yes, cyber ostracism hurts, but if we allow the fear of the mob to dictate our behavior, we give the most reactionary, punitive voices the power to define reality. The ethical solution isn't hiding behind intellectualization or denial. It is practicing proactive accountability.
Which looks like what, practically?
When we normalize saying, I was wrong, and here's what I learned, we slowly shift the cultural metric from being right at all costs to being a learner.
That is a very noble, philosophical stance. But practically speaking, the collision with error online often results in a person losing their job, their reputation, and their mental health. You're asking everyday individuals to act as martyrs for the sake of an epistemic ideal.
I don't think it's martyrdom.
For a person whose self-worth is already heavily contingent on social approval, the person living in that house on the fault line, that collision doesn't lead to refined truth. It leads to severe anxiety, depression, and complete social withdrawal.
It is incredibly difficult, I grant you that. But consider what happens when we decouple our identity from our opinions. Adam Grant points out that we get so caught up in our ideas that we let them define us.
Right?
If your identity is, I am the person who is always right, then being proven wrong is an ego death. The foundation of your house cracks. But if your identity is, I am a person who seeks the truth, even when it's deeply uncomfortable, then being proven wrong is just a data point. It's just a step in your personal growth.
But shifting your identity like that requires a level of psychological maturity that, clinically speaking, takes years of deep therapeutic work to achieve. You can't just flip a switch and tell someone facing a massive public backlash to detach their identity from their opinions. It's asking someone to change their skeletal structure while running a marathon.
No, it's a practice. It's exactly like building a muscle. You don't start by confessing your deepest, darkest failures to a million strangers online. You start small.
Small steps.
Yes, you admit a minor oversight to a trusted colleague. You tell your child you handled the disagreement poorly. And every time a leader or an average worker or a public figure models that behavior, every time they rumble with their own imperfections without resorting to defensiveness, they give everyone around them permission to do the same. They create a localized pocket of psychological safety in an otherwise hostile world.
I think we have fundamentally different views on the capacity of the average person to withstand that hostility without fracturing.
That might be true. Let's summarize where we've landed on this, because the implications for how we live and work are just massive. I maintain that despite the very real neurobiological risks of the digital arena and the workplace, the courage to be wrong in public is the ultimate driver of personal resilience and societal progress.
And it's a bold stance.
By embracing intellectual humility and consciously stepping out from behind our primitive ego defenses, we transition from a fragile, performative confidence to genuine, stable self-worth. It is the only ethical path forward if we want to foster scientific truth and wholehearted human connection.
And I maintain that we must respect the profound psychological weight of fragile self-esteem. While stable self-worth is absolutely a worthy destination, we cannot ignore the clinical reality that ego defenses exist to keep people psychologically intact.
Right, the survival mechanism.
Exactly. Furthermore, we have to recognize that our current digital environment, driven by the attention economy and outrage algorithms, frequently weaponizes vulnerability rather than rewarding it. Imposing a blanket expectation of public vulnerability ignores the competence penalty faced by the average person and the very real pain of social ostracism.
I think where we absolutely converge, though, is on the ultimate goal: achieving that stable, non-contingent self-worth.
Agreed. Because if your self-worth isn't contingent on external validation, if your house isn't built on that fault line, the threat of the public square diminishes significantly.
And we both recognize that our current societal structures, from, perfectionistic parenting models that punish failure to online mob justice that archives it forever, make achieving that stability incredibly difficult.
It is an uphill battle against both our own evolutionary neurobiology and our modern technology.
It really is. So, to our listeners, we suggest you reflect on your own ego defenses today. Think about the last time you made a mistake, whether it was hiding an error from your manager or maybe deleting a post that received pushback online.
We've all been there.
Did you experience it as a learning opportunity, or did your brain process it as an existential threat? Did you reach for rationalization and blame, or did you have the courage to sit with the discomfort? There is much more to explore in the source material regarding the mechanics of self-compassion, cognitive calibration, and how to actually build that internal stability, which we highly recommend diving into.
Because understanding your own psychological toolkit is really the first step toward figuring out how much vulnerability you can actually afford to practice in your daily life.
Exactly. Think back to the start of our conversation. You can build a fortress of ego defenses that might keep you safe from the arrows of the digital mob and the judgments of your coworkers, but ask yourself, is the safety of that fortress worth the isolation of never truly being known? We'll leave you to determine how you will navigate the epistemic arena in your own life and whether you're ready to lower the drawbridge.
That wraps up today's journey. Thanks to my friends for sharing their thoughts, and to you for being part of this circle. Remember, inspiration isn't found once, it's built every day in small choices. If this talk spoke to you, share it, follow along, and let's keep the conversation alive. Until next time, stay curious and stay inspired.